Before I get started in this, I want to take the opportunity to introduce the folks that have agreed to be members of our panel today. First of all, Mr. Steve Golubic to my left. Steve brings just a wealth of knowledge from the national level on tribal nations. Steve, as you can see by his biography, he was the Director of Tribal Affairs at DHS, the Tribal Liaison, National Tribal Liaison at FEMA. I want to talk to you a little bit about how we got to be here. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story to begin with. I feel like the odd person out up here. I am not tribal. I will just say that up front. I am not tribal. I'm rather Irish, if you want to come down to it. So that's the way it is. Graduated out of the master's degree program here 10 years ago. And we're going to talk about that some more tomorrow. So 10 years ago, I came out of the master's degree program, and I've been working in Homeland Defense, Homeland Security since. And I'm here to say that I started out, I think this is a terrific program. I love it. Come back here as much as I can. And I want to say I'm one of you. I started out, and I'm one of you that I took my degree out of CHDS and went out to the field and tried to apply that degree to the best that I can to improve the field of Homeland Defense and Homeland Security. Went along doing what I do at Northern Command, writing academic papers, doing those kinds of things, coming back out to CHDS periodically. And what I didn't realize was that I was missing something along the way. And I was missing this idea of integration, the full integration of all of our agencies, all of our capabilities into national preparedness. I looked at the agenda today, and so far we've talked about the roles of the media, San Bernardino, global health, and I really like Dr. Worth's presentation on global health. Tomorrow we're going to talk about aviation industry, and we're going to talk about cyber threats. And we're going to talk about how those impact federal, state, local collaboration. But if we say federal, state, local collaboration, what's missing? Obviously, the tribal collaboration is what's missing. And for years, I went along not realizing that, how much that was missing. I saw PPD-8, National Preparedness, come out in 2011. And I looked at it, read it, thought this is a very good document, and I think it's a transformative document for Homeland Defense and Homeland Security. It called for the integration and it integrated all of nation capabilities approach to preparedness, and it specified that it included the tribal nations. That didn't register with me. It just didn't register with me at the time. I later had the privilege to go to the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative at Harvard and write a project up there, or lead a project up there, and write a paper on national preparedness integration. And I went back recently to look at that paper, and in that paper, I think it was a great paper, but it talked about federal, state, and local integration in national preparedness. So even as late as 2012, I still wasn't understanding the need for tribal integration. 2013 comes along, and I had decided to pursue my doctorate. It was time to do my dissertation. I had completed the coursework and I was in a conversation one day with my mentor at U.S. Northern Command, great lady, PhD, who took me under her wings, and we were talking about what should I choose as my subject for study. And she said, "You've written a lot about national preparedness and the integration of efforts." She leaned over and she quite literally whispered to me, "Go look at the tribes." "What do you mean?" "Go look at the tribes and you'll figure it out." That was the only thing she would tell me. So I took a week or two and I stepped back and I went home and I sat down and I started searching the tribes. And what does it mean? And it just set me back. Because here I was with this great CHDS education. I had gotten a chance to go rub shoulders with folks at Harvard, and I came back and I thought I was mastering my profession at that time. But here came someone who pointed something out to me that I knew absolutely nothing about. I just had not appreciated. So the end of that story is I did my dissertation on tribal nation integration and national preparedness, and that began a journey that has wound up with us up here and meeting an entirely new group of people and realizing some things that I just didn't know before. So what I'd like to do, or what we'd like to do, to start today, is we want to have a discussion. And we can stand up here and talk, or we can make this a collaborative effort, but we'd really like to have more dialogue than presentation. So if you have questions or you have comments, we would ask you to bring those out as we go along. But we want to have a discussion or an interactive dialogue on tribal nation integration and national preparedness. I want to point a couple of things out. It's okay if this conversation is a little bit provocative. If we shake up some long ingrained sensibilities, that's okay too. We're all professionals in the room, and at the end of the day, there are a couple of things we'd like to do. We'd like to leave you with an understanding of the moral and legal obligations that we as a nation have to the tribal nations. I also would like to, I personally, and we as a group would like to leave you with an idea of the Homeland Defense, Homeland Security practical imperative for greater integration of the tribal nations into preparedness. At the same time, there's some real issues involved with that. There's some barriers to that still remain to be overcome, and we want to point those out as we go. So, at the end of the day, what does success look like? Success will look like all of us leaving with some new understandings, some interactive dialogue, and some things that we can all take back to our organizations, our agencies for future thought. Maybe to think about, maybe to look for ways to reach out and achieve a better Homeland Defense, Homeland Security enterprise. That's what we would like to see at the end of the day. So, before I hand things over to Margaret, I'd like to just point this slide out. National preparedness, the reality for tribal nations. In 2013, Jefferson Keel, who was president of the National Congress of American Indians at the time, very accurately pointed out that the well-being and the security of tribal nations is synonymous with the well-being and security of the nation as a whole. And I hope you'll understand that or have a greater understanding of that when we finish today. At the same time, the road to getting there has been difficult. If you look at the DHS National Preparedness Report comment at the bottom from 2014, the path to getting there has not been easy. We're not there yet. And by at least one estimate I've heard, and this is through no fault of their own, this is just a reality of the situation, the tribal nations are maybe 10 to 12 years behind in integrating into our national preparedness effort than the federal, state, and local mantra that we use. As a defense planner, I look for seams and gaps of vulnerability that we either want to defend or we want to exploit. To me, that presents a seam of vulnerability, a gap. And if we want to have a true Homeland Security enterprise, we're not going to have it until we close that gap or shrink that gap or reduce it, get it down to something that's manageable. So from that point, without further ado, I'm going to let Margaret step up and tell you a few things about tribal nations that you may not know. I certainly didn't know when I began this journey, and I suspect many of you may not know also. Again, we'd like this to be a dialogue. So if you see things that you have a question about, please bring them up as we go.
I know starting in this journey, one of the things that I've learned on the education side is that people don't have a great understanding of the impacts of Indian country. Where are they? How many tribes does that include? What does it look like? Why are we all so different? Why do we complain about things? When people start talking about the issues that the tribes have faced, a lot of people tend to shut down. They don't understand the history behind that. And I, coming out of this class, became super collaborative in those efforts and really wanted to take a different aspect of it and look at, okay, we can acknowledge what's occurred, we can look at the numbers and perspective, but where do we go from here and how do we make things better for everyone involved? So before we take that step and talk about how we become collaborative and have that dialogue, we really need to talk about who Indian country is and what that looks like. 567, the number of sovereign tribal nations, tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, communities, and Native Alaskan villages. Not every tribe has a reservation. Not every tribe has their own land assigned to them. 5.2 million. The number of people classified as Native American, 1.7% of the American population. That includes members and non-members of tribal nations. When you look at this map, it illustrates the significance of Native American and tribal nation dispersion and integration, but really look at the amount of people that are on the borders alone. This graphic should give you a much better understanding of the amount of tribal nation involvement and why it's important to our Homeland Security. 35, number of states with the tribal nation within the geographic border. 100 million. Total acres of landmass under American Indian or Alaska Native control. That would make Indian country the 4th largest state. 42nd. The Navajo Nation would be the 42nd largest state in the Union. 19. Number of tribal nations larger than the state of Rhode Island. 12. Number of tribal nations larger than Delaware. 40 plus. Tribal nations that have reserved or traditional lands that span the borders within Canada or Mexico. 260. Tribal lands share 260 miles of international borders. That is 100 miles longer than California's border with Mexico. 229. Tribal nations located in Alaska. 338. Tribal nations located in the other 34 states. 110. Number of tribal nations in California. 29%. Percentage of Native peoples that live in poverty in 2010. That's 15% of the nation, and it's the highest of any ethnic group. The Navajo Nation is roughly the size of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont combined. In that area, there are 13 grocery stores. 370, treaties between tribes and other governments. 8, the total number of federal disaster declarations approved for tribes. That's been since 2013 when the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act was passed to allow tribal nations to directly request disaster declarations. And having said that, we look at some of the policies that have been done that are familiar to us in recent history. The Sandy Recovery Improvement Act is one of them. But how many of those policies are put in place and there's not an implementation program that goes along with that? So when you look at the federal declaration process alone, the first 3 declarations that were done on a whim with no clear direction, no document to follow, no clear format of what needs to be submitted, what the requirements are. And so you had tribes that were submitting for ridiculous amounts of money for reimbursement, and only half of that was being reimbursed because they couldn't document or prove based on their own data. They didn't have CAD systems to show where their resources were, when they were responding, how many people they had in the field. And those are things that the tribal nations on a daily basis are having to overcome. When you look at Public Law 280, there are several Public Law 280 states which requires that the local jurisdictions, the police departments, take care of criminal matters on the reservation. It was done in 1967, and there is still not an implementation plan in place for the PL 280 law. FirstNet, I am an employee of FirstNet at this point. Historically, they've done some really big things. They're the first agency to go after tribal people to do tribal business. Awesome, but the act was written without the tribes included, or the federal agencies included for that matter. We were left out, and trying to go back and fix that now on an act that was written in 2012 is very problematic when the president has signed executive order after executive order saying that the tribes will be included. The desire to collaborate is there. The tribes are unsure how to be involved and how to integrate and get through the government documentation.
Before I get into the presentation as we have it on the slides, want to make a couple of points to reiterate a couple of things that Margaret said and that, well, both Don and Margaret had said. One of the things that, because of my background, where I came from, the things that I did before I took that giant leap into this big thing called retirement, was working in Indian country with the federal government. And one of the things that we tried for years and years and years to do was get the federal government just to listen to what we had to say. So many times in daily life in the federal government, in my positions, I found the most difficult thing to do was to get other people to listen to what I had to say. Whatever your thoughts are, whatever your prejudices and ideas are, whatever your upbringing is, it's okay. It's okay for us as tribal people. We accept it. The thing that we ask is that you accept us. How many of you, either by show of hands or not, how many of you know who the tribes are in your states where you live? Some of you do. Great. I am very happy to see that. Makes me feel good. How many of you don't know if there are tribes in the state where you live? A few of you. Okay, great. How many of you in your careers have been educated in tribal law, tribal culture? And some of you have? Okay. I'm glad to hear that too. The reason I ask those questions is because what it showed me when you raised your hands or didn't, and that's perfectly fine if you didn't, is that we still have a lot of work to do. Now, I've been married for a long time, and I know that when my wife says, Steve, we have some things that we need to get done, I know exactly what that means. It means I have a lot of things to get done because my wife thinks it's a great idea. For the most part, that's okay. You know, we have what we call a real partnership. She tells me what to do and I do it. Life is good, you know, it's okay. We're not at that level with the federal government. If you look at the slide before you, the one thing I want to point out, first of all, is this thing called the pre-Columbian period and the map that's right next to that item on the slide. It's all red. It's called the pre-Columbian period, and it makes me kind of laugh, and I remember sitting in several FEMA and DHS meetings during my time in D.C. When everybody was getting all excited because the next holiday on the calendar was Columbus Day. Well, you know, things started happening after that guy got lost in the West Indies and never did set foot on what is known now as the United States. And I never could understand why in the world we would celebrate somebody who got lost out in the middle of the ocean. But we do, and that's okay. We choose to work that day because to us, that represents something really bad that began to happen to our people. Call it the pre-Columbian period for a really good reason. That's because Europeans had not yet been here in any great force. I guess if you have time in your busy days and lives to watch the History Channel on occasion, there's been some programs lately that talk about did Columbus really discover America? Well, we know he got lost, and there were probably some other folks that got here before he did. But pre-Columbian to us means somebody came here and started telling us what to do. We weren't married to them. We didn't have a partnership. We didn't have a government-to-government relationship with those people. They just came in here and decided they were going to take over the place. A lot of times we're told, you know what, you Indians ought to just get over it. You know, it was a long time ago. It was 1492, and, you know, just get over it, will you? Well, we can't, because if you look at the slide, you'll see some of the other things that are on here that are really very recent. Forced relocation, that didn't happen 400 years ago. It started back then. It didn't happen completely back then. Then there was the time when, with a stroke of a pen, we no longer existed as people. Somebody back in 1945 decided, hey, I got a great idea. The only way to get rid of the Indians is we'll just not make them people. So there was legislation signed that said, nope, you're not people anymore. 20 years later, somebody said, gee, we kind of screwed that one up. We never should have done that. Well, maybe we ought to make them people again, because we're still here. We have been here forever. And I say that only because I want you to know we are still here. Our elders sometimes tell us that we're going to be here long after you, who came here in 1492 with the first act of terrorism, and we probably should have had a DHS at that point, but we never did. We didn't know. But our elders tell us they will be gone. We will still be here. We have been here forever. In 1944, the National Congress of American Indians was formed, just before we were terminated. Somebody didn't like us. They wanted to get rid of us. So just before that happened, the National Congress of American Indians was formed. The reason it was formed, if you go back to the treaties, Margaret mentioned 370 treaties. Those treaties still exist. They're still valid. They're legal documents. Don said we have a moral and a legal obligation to fulfill those treaties. There's one that we always seem to forget. One that I pointed out in FEMA and DHS that's more important than any of the other ones that have been signed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the United States Constitution. Because in the United States Constitution, it defines tribes as sovereign nations. We were recognized as sovereign nations before the states were formed. Pretty amazing. How many of you knew that? Anybody? One individual. Great. 2 individuals. Thank you. So how is it that now we're subordinate? How is it now that nobody recognizes tribes, nobody wants to work with tribes, nobody wants to take the time to learn who we are, why we exist, what our culture is, what our government structure is? You can't work with people that you don't know. We want to be part of Homeland Security, disaster preparedness, any of those things that have been going on since the Civil Defense Act of 1950. We haven't been included. Tribal emergency management is a lot younger than some of you may think. As a matter of fact, it started in 1998 on the Gila River Indian Reservation in Arizona. There was a massive pile of used tires, and it caught on fire. Big hazmat incident. Tribal council was meeting, and they talked to a colleague of ours and said, "Hey, Tim, didn't you take one of those hazardous materials classes?" Tim said, "Yes, sir, I did." He says, "Good, you're the tribal emergency manager, go put out that fire." That's how tribal emergency management started, and that was about 1998. So over the last 18 years, we've had some catching up to do. It's difficult for us to do that when people refuse to work with us. They call us partners, and they say, "Oh yeah, tribes are our partners. We give them information all the time." Yeah, you do. But you don't work with us. Here's a list of some of the Homeland Security policies and some of the impacts that they've had on tribal nations. There's a common theme here. Okay, if you look under each of the bullet points that outlines the laws, it says subordinate tribal nations to the states. It's a common theme. There's another common theme that's not listed on this slide, and that's the one where you as federal employees, or you as state employees, or you as county or city employees, whatever your job title is, whatever you do, whichever government where you work, sit down wherever it is that you congregate, and you write policies and procedures and plans, and then you come to the tribes and say, "Oh, by the way, here's this new policy that we developed. Now implement it." Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that that's not a true partnership. The only way we're going to have a true partnership is if you call us up and say, hey, Steve, we're thinking about developing a new policy. We'd like you to sit on the policy development committee. Do you have time to do that? First meeting is on such and such a date, place, time, all that good stuff. Call us to the table. I might get in trouble for saying this next one, but I'm going to say it anyway because it needs to be said. In all of these laws that you see, 567 tribal nations have not been included. Current FEMA administrator, a whole bunch of years ago when I was still the National Tribal Liaison at headquarters, pulled me aside one day and said, Steve, we need to make some changes. There's that we word again. And I looked at him and I said, I know what that means. I got a lot of work to do, and that's okay. I can do that. But he pulled me aside and he said to me in conversation, I got this new thing that we always talk about, this whole of community thing. And we want tribes to be a part of that. And I looked at him and I said, sir, there's a big problem here. Big problem is whole of community is spelled W-H-O-L-E. But there are 567 wholes, H-O-L-E-S, in your whole of community concept. And he scratched his head and what do you mean? I says it's the 567 federally recognized tribes. We're not part of everything that FEMA is doing. We're not part of everything that Homeland Security is doing. We're not part of a lot of what other federal agencies are not doing with tribes. Now, I'm not picking on FEMA or DHS. I happen to work there. So I know I was part of all of those things. And he said, then we're going to have to fix that. And I took the man at his word and said, all right, let's get started. So as we look at these policies and procedures, some of these turned out to be pretty good for us. Presidential Executive Order 13175 says in there that federal government and all its agencies are supposed to consult with tribal nations on a government-to-government level. Now, I can also tell you this. During my time at both FEMA and DHS, I was not reaching out to the tribes on a true government-to-government level. When policies and plans and procedures are developed, do you only go to one state to do that? Or do you include all 50? But you include all 50. If you do that, why then should we only include one tribe out of 567? Well, we can't get the tribes to cooperate, can't get them all at the table. We've got 500 plus members of Congress that we can't get all at the table either. They don't agree on a whole lot of anything sometimes, it seems. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but it takes a majority. They don't all have to vote the same way, they don't all have to think the same way. Neither do we. If you don't ask, you're never going to find out. You're never going to be able to get tribes at the table. So the challenge really is, when you do consultation, is it with a capital C, where it's on a nation-to-nation basis or a government-to-government basis? Do you take the highest elected or appointed official in your agency in the federal government, and does that individual meet with the highest elected official in the tribe? Or do you go down about 6 or 8 layers and send somebody? Because you have to check the box and say, oh yeah, we consulted with the tribes. Is there still resistance to even make the effort? You bet there is. I haven't been retired that long, and I still every once in a while have some colleagues from FEMA that'll call me on the phone and say, hey Steve, have you heard? We didn't do it again this time. Now we have to go back. Margaret mentioned that with FirstNet. There are so many of these laws and policies and procedures that are done without tribal input. How can you have a whole of community, W-H-O-L-E, if you don't include an entire segment of that community? This is our land. We're still here. We have been here forever. We'll remain. We want to be part of what it is that you're doing. So don't be afraid to call us up on the phone. Do some homework ahead of time. Find out who we are. Find out where we live. Find out what resources we have and don't have. Because a lot of times, the majority of our populations live in places where you really don't want to go because we were forced to go there. It wasn't our choice. We were happy living where we were. Somebody made us move. There's no running water. There's no electricity. There's no iPods and iPads and Crackberries and Blackberries and all those other kind of instruments that everybody uses. And not many of our people walk around like this. We don't. Our younger generations do because they're being taught that in school. But the elders don't. They don't know. They don't understand. They've never been exposed to it. A lot of them don't speak English as their first language. They speak their nation's language, their people's language. Some of them learn English, some of them don't. I had some real challenges for a while, trying to get FEMA to understand that there are words that they choose to use because, I don't know, some reason, that don't translate into Navajo or Sioux or Yupik or Ojibwe or Seminole or Seneca or Oneida or any of the other languages that we speak. There's no translation. If you look at some of the continuity of operations plans, tribes are expected to be part of that. Develop a continuity of operations. What happens if? You have to have some place to take your government and make it work. Boy, I had some very long and hard discussions with some of the people in the program that was developing that concept and developing the policies. And they wanted to use this word called devolution. You know what devolution means? I didn't, but it meant something to the people that were writing this policy. After this whole thing was done and I argued, I said, please find another word to describe what devolution means in continuity of operations. Nope, this is the way we're going to do it. So I taught one of the first classes to the tribes about continuity of operations, and I said the word devolution during the presentation and then during the training. And a gentleman from the Navajo Nation had moved to the side of the room and was actually kind of sitting on the floor. He was comfortable doing that. And he raised his hand and he said, you know, I'm kind of puzzled. He said, when I go back to my tribe and I talk to the tribal elders, because they're going to want to know what I learned, how is this going to help my tribe? How is it going to help our people? He said, when I go back there, he said, I don't know what the heck devolution means. And there is no Navajo word to translate devolution. How do I explain that to the elders? I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't have an answer for him. Every time we teach the class, that comes up. The reason I'm taking you through this, instead of just paying attention to the policies and procedures, is to make you aware, to help you learn, so that when you go home, you say, you know, that guy out in Monterey said some things that, doggone, I'm supposed to look up on the internet the names of the tribes that are in my state, and I'm supposed to learn a little bit about who they are and why it's so difficult. We don't want to be resistant to the things that you want to do. We want to be included. We want to go from being acquaintances, which I really think we are now. If we're going to be really honest about this, we're acquaintances with the federal government. We sort of have a love-hate relationship with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Department of Interior. That's been going on for a while. Same thing with other agencies within the federal government. Only because we're not included. There are holes in your plans, ladies and gentlemen. There are holes in your policies. There are holes in your programs. It's the tribal nations of this country. We haven't gone anywhere. I remember a few years ago talking about the National Response Framework. I was on the writing team. And we lobbied, I guess, maybe that's not a good word because I was a Fed and we're not supposed to lobby. We talked about and discussed including tribes and including a tribal annex in the National Response Framework. And we were told it wasn't necessary because tribal affairs was plugged in somewhere. My argument was, if we have all of these annexes and we have all of these agencies of the federal government who are building this National Response Framework, where are we going to take that? Where are tribes included? It was in one section of the NRF. And I said, but as tribal nations, as sovereign nations, we interact with all. It's not just one little section. We're relegated to one little section and subordinate in all the others, if at all included. 3 years later, we had to do another rewrite. Brought up the same conversation. Now, if you look at this slide, we're down to 2015, and there's a Tribal Coordination Support Annex that is in draft form. I was told a couple of years ago by people on the administrative team that the administrator was cutting back the number of annexes and didn't want to add any more. Well, okay, there was some logic to that. I understood that. Didn't have a problem with it. There were a couple that were supposed to have been eliminated, or the annex was, or the space for that annex was going to be there, but there wasn't going to be anything in it. So I asked, and I said, since you're going to leave this here, why not insert the tribal annex? We're part of everyone. There's not some place in the National Response Framework where we're not included. I don't think that's happened yet. Even though I'm retired, I'm still working on the National Response Framework. And I'm an advocate for the tribes in order for them to be included where they belong, as part of the whole of community. What I would like to do is give you some recommendations, some things that you can take home and say, okay, I got something from this. First thing I'd like to ask you to do is call us on the phone. Find out who your counterpart is at the tribe. Start with one tribe. Find out who your counterpart is, call them on the phone, ask for a meeting. And all I want you to do is go to that meeting and get to know your counterpart. Y'all have taken Emergency Management 101, right? What's the first thing you learn in Emergency Management 101? The worst time to meet the people that are going to be working with you and responding to a disaster is when the disaster happens, right? We're supposed to do all this planning ahead. We're supposed to develop relationships, MOUs and MOAs and all these other kinds of things. So before the next one happens, wherever it is that you live, go get to know the players that are going to be playing with you. We also learned in Emergency Management 101, disasters know no boundaries. There's no lines on the map where a disaster starts in one place and then hits this imaginary line because it's on the map and says, oops, I guess I better stop there. That doesn't happen. We know that. It keeps going, does what it's going to do. All I want you to do is get to know who's going to be working with you in the next one. Then set up a meeting. They already know, because you introduced yourself on the phone, asked for a meeting, who you are and what you want. What I really don't want you to do, and there are do's and don'ts in working in Indian country. We don't have time to get into all of them. But one of the don'ts is please do not go into the meeting put out your hand to shake someone's hand and say, "Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you." That is an immediate cancellation of your credibility. You will not be asked to come back for a second meeting if you do that. If you do, it'll be very reluctantly, depending on what you have to say after that. But that's one of the worst phrases that you can ever use in Indian country. I'm from the government and here to help. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been hearing that for 500-600 years now, something like that. And you haven't helped a whole lot. Okay, so please don't use that phrase. The other thing I'd like you to do is learn some culture. If you've never been to a cultural event, go. Go to a powwow, go to a festival, go to a feast. Find out what happens. Ask questions. Please be respectful when you do that, but ask questions. Here's a difficult one, I think, and it's a challenge for a lot of folks. And it has to do with funding. I said we're very young as tribal emergency managers, less than 20 years old. In your world, you're a lot older than that, close to 100. So you would qualify as elders in our tribes. Funding is a real problem for Indian country. We're behind. We know that. You know that. If we don't get the same funding levels, or if we're not brought up to speed, we're never going to be able to work as equal partners in any kind of a policy or program or response to a disaster or a terrorism event. We're not going to be able to fight crime. We're not going to be able to do anything with drug trafficking. About 10 years ago, I was sitting with a group of tribal leaders and was asking them, what are the things that are most important where you live? What can we as a federal agency and FEMA be able to do to help you? Or at DHS, what can we do? I had one tribal leader said, "Steve, nobody pays attention to us, nobody cares. And most of the time they don't even know we exist." And I, "Mr. Chairman," I said, how do you mean? And he said, "We have a serious drug problem on our reservation." He is an elected tribal leader from a tribe in Kansas. I'm not going to identify the tribe or the individual. And he says, geographically, we're about in the middle of the country. And he said, what happens is the drug cartels send people up to our reservation because they know it's easy pickings, because the federal government doesn't care about us. The federal government isn't doing anything to help us fight drug trafficking or drug problems in the United States. What they do is they send people there. They supposedly fall in love, get married with a woman from the tribe, and then they take that woman back down across the border and make her a mule and carry drugs back to the reservation so that those people who are embedded in the tribe now can then distribute their drugs. And it really hit me when he said that. Nobody cares about us. We have the same problems that the city of New York does, or Los Angeles, or any other city, town, state in the United States, but nobody cares. We can't get the federal government to listen. Ladies and gentlemen, that's a very sad commentary. You have the power to make it different. You can make it better. You can write history. RIGHT. And you also have the power through your education, through your status in government, through the things that you have done, through the things that you have learned, you can also write history. WRITE. The challenges are there. We know it. We've been making this concerted effort over the last probably 10 years to make things different in Indian country, to write a new chapter, so that we go from being acquaintances to where we can become friends, to where we can become colleagues, and then perhaps we can be true partners on a nation-to-nation basis with the federal government, with the state governments. We'd love to see that. We'd love to have you come along for the ride. going to be fun. I come from Wisconsin, and one of the things that we do when we're getting ready to do something, we say, here, hold my beer and watch this, it's going to be fun. Well, hold my beer and watch this, ladies and gentlemen, come along with me. That's my invitation to you. It's going to be a lot of work. We're going to have to change some minds. We're going to have to change the way that people do things. It can be done. We can do it. We can control the things that are important to all of us in Homeland Security emergency management. We can do it. I'm convinced of it. I just hope that the Creator allows me to live long enough to see it. I have one other thing that I would like to talk about just briefly. Some of the challenges that I faced. Don asked me when we were putting this thing together to talk about some of the challenges that I faced. One of the ones was that I had absolutely no authority to act. I had to get approval for everything through this whole chain of people who either did or didn't agree with what I was doing. And that was okay. I knew it was part of the job. I knew it was part of the challenge for me. But I had no authority to act. It's really difficult to go to a tribal leader and say, Mr. President, Governor, Chairman, Chief, I hear you, but I can't do anything about it. All I can do is take this back and hope that somebody will listen, hope that somebody will understand, hope that somebody will take the time to say, you know what, we need to address this and we need to make a positive difference, not only for the federal government, but for the tribes of our nation. And we need to fill those 567 holes. We can do it. Collectively, all of us sitting in this room can do it. I ask you to come along with me. One of the other challenges I found was that people were real nice to my face. When we were sitting in a meeting, everybody was, oh yeah, Steve, great idea. Yeah, I like that. Good idea. And as soon as we walked out the door, everybody said, what the heck's the matter with that guy? Doesn't he know that we're never ever going to do that? Nope, I didn't. Only because I believed and I knew that we could if we worked together. So it was hard. It was a real challenge. I'm happy to say that there have been some improvements in the way that DHS and FEMA have done business with tribes over the last couple of years. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that it's all a rosy picture, because it's not. There's a long way for all of us to go. We can do it together. We can develop that partnership. I hope someday we can. Include tribes in your training, in your exercising, in your program plan development. Include tribes in everything that you do. 35 states have federally recognized tribes. There's about 180 not yet federally recognized tribes. They're recognized by states, but they're not recognized by the federal government yet. They're not yet federally recognized tribes. They're still tribes, and they are still tribal people, but they're not yet federally recognized. That shouldn't stop us. It should be another incentive for doing the right things for the right reasons. Thank you.
All right, I want to take a little bit to try to build a little more on what Steve just said. And as I said earlier, my background is Homeland Defense, Homeland Security. That's what I've been doing all my life, all my adult life. And I want to take his recommendations and I'm just going to present them to you in a Homeland Defense, Homeland Security structure and let you take those home with you. When I set out to do my study, the first thing I did was try to define the operating environment. And when you look at this, we've got any number of guiding documents that are out there, the guiding authorities. First thing that I looked at was the environment. We know the post 9/11 environment is changing. No doubt there. We're going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but key among those things are technological advances in social networking. Tremendous impacts there. We also know that there are emerging threats in this environment. Steve talked about the cartels and their nearly free operation across some tribal lands, transnational criminal organization. We know that the tribal nations, just like the cities and the counties, the states, are vulnerable to homegrown extremism as well. The key point here is no one's immune. Steve brought out that disasters are not constrained by boundaries. Dr. Wirth talked about the global health environment. I think that's just a key point, that disasters don't know boundaries. If you have a tribal nation in your area of responsibility and they have problems like that, it's not going to be confined to their problem. If you have problems in your community like that and you have tribal nations, it's not going to be confined outside the tribes. It's going to cross all boundaries. So no one's immune to that. And that's the point I want to bring out, that we have mutual interest. As Jefferson Keel said, our interests are synonymous. So the post 9/11 world is changing. The all of nation approach, the whole of nation approach that Steve talked about, that's the solution. In that, there are a number of tenets. It has to include the tribes as well as the federal, state, local, and non-governmental organizations. It has to be all of nation, truly all of nation, not just in the effects, but in the planning to begin. We've got to have tribal nation input in the planning. Risk-based integrated planning. The outcome, mutual increased security, mutual reduced vulnerability for all of us. That's the post 9/11 approach. What Steve was talking about was, and Margaret has talked about, was the implication, the gap. Historically, the people, disenfranchised, impoverished, vulnerable to exploitation, vulnerable to extremism, vulnerable to radicalization. If it's a tribal nation problem, it's all of our problem, and it goes that goes both ways. When I was doing my study, I found evidence, and this is open source documents, found evidence of youth gang development on tribal lands. I found an organization called the Republic of Lakota that was, at that time, trying to develop its own cyber currency called Mazacoin to mirror Bitcoin so that it could conduct operations. This was a radicalized group, not accepted or recognized by anyone that I could find, but trying to develop its own cyber currency so that it could conduct transactions outside the view of the federal government. Not transactions that would be in the interest of others, but transactions to their own ideology. I found an organization called Idle No More, which is a First Nation group out of Canada that specializes in social networking. It has successfully coordinated flash mobs within the United States on a number of occasions. I also found in South America, this is a little bit off the track, but I found in South America a group called the YU Islamic Autonomy. And that's a group that represents Hezbollah in Latin America in its attempts to make inroads into the native peoples of the Americas. So I found in open source documentation that not only were the tribal nations vulnerable to exploitation, but there were indicators that it's happening. So the implication to me was, until we can reduce that gap and close that gap, we can't have Homeland Defense and Homeland Security. We're not going to have a closed enterprise until we can reduce gaps like that. So those are the people. When we look at the lands, Margaret talked about the lands. The idea that when you bring all this together as an aggregate, and it equates to the fourth largest state in the union, that's pretty incredible. To me, that's pretty significant. Again, these lands are critical. They're not only crisscrossed by critical infrastructure that has to be protected, and again, that infrastructure doesn't know boundaries either. It's still got to be protected across boundaries. But neither do the transnational criminal organizations, the cartels that can use those lands as conduits. And if they're using the tribal lands as conduits, then they're coming into other communities as well through those conduits. And again, that's not pointing blame or trying to say, well, somebody's wrong in this. That's simply saying this is the situation that we have to deal with. So as I looked at it, coming back to Steve's recap of all those national policies, as I tried to look at all the policies, I found a situation that really was uncertain, complex, polarizing. It was impossible to get my conceptual arms around it to understand it. So I got permission to do a study called a narrative policy analysis. Basically, I went out to collect the stories of the people who are in the know. I went out and did extensive interviews and to get those stories and to find out, well, what is the truth at ground level? And that's where it became very enlightening. This is the research question. I simply wanted to know, what have the tribal nations experienced in national policies or preparedness policies since 9/11? What has been their experience? And I set out to talk to two groups of people. First group was to construct a government narrative. I talked to representatives from FEMA, BIA, DOD. Second group was I went out and talked to tribal nation representatives, either representatives of tribal nations themselves, or representatives from some non-governmental organizations, the Tribal Emergency Management Association and the National Tribal Emergency Management Council, who work on behalf of tribes. The government representatives gave me the conventional narrative. The tribal representatives gave me the counter narrative. The idea was to look at their stories, do in-depth interviews, collect their stories, and then synthesize all that to build a meta-narrative of recommendations. What's the way forward? And much of what I'm going to tell you is going to echo what Steve has said here. So what did they say? This is what surprised me. When it comes to the idea of tribal nations as sovereign governments, the government participants told me, well, there's a lack of understanding on both sides. The tribal participants told me they were looking for mutual respect and understanding. So I found a collusion in those two stories. When it looked at representation and resourcing, the government representatives again said there's a need for greater resourcing. There's or resourcing and inclusion. I heard repeatedly on the tribal side a seat at the table. As Steve and Margaret have said, they are interested in being participants, greater participants. I think part of the problem there is getting that involvement at the outset of the planning process and not at the tail end of the planning process. That's one of the things that I learned. The approaches. 567 is a big number. When you're a government agency or you're a government employee, most of us in this room, I think, are government employees, 567 different tribal nations to deal with is a big number. It's difficult to manage. So in government, we have a tendency to take pro forma approaches. Everyone gets the same policy, everyone gets the same approach. That won't work. Very candidly, that won't work. One size fits all does not work well with the tribes. Again, I heard one of the most telling comments was, as Steve pointed out, don't tell tribal nations what to do, ask them what they need so they can become full partners. Threats, both sides were agreed that the complexity of threats was growing, that the tribes were not immune. Federal policies, as Steve said, not always effective. The playing field is not level. One key point here, the requirement to compete with states for funding or resourcing. The majority of tribal nations just cannot do that. They don't have the resources or the government structure of the states, and they've not been set up for success to compete that way. So having to compete with states becomes a very problematic, almost impossible situation for them in most cases. Liaison. Too many times, if there is a tribal liaison, it's a collateral duty. It's someone who's been, the history has been it's a collateral duty on the federal side. People who get this as their second duty that they do after they get their primary duty done in their federal jobs. The reality on the tribal side is many, if not most, tribal nations cannot afford full-time emergency managers. That means preparedness becomes a luxury. The disaster thresholds. You know, $1 million disaster threshold for a state is not that high, but it can be overwhelming for a tribal nation. It can be absolutely overwhelming. Even if it gets pared down so that they only have to come up with their 10% of that or 25% of that. It just becomes overwhelming, and they cannot meet those thresholds. One comment that I think is most telling is maybe those thresholds are not appropriate for tribal nations. Maybe it's time to look at a different standard for tribal nations for those disaster thresholds. One of the things I learned as I was doing my research, and I truly did not know this before, there are regional tribal associations that do the equivalent of EMAC for one another around the nation. In all my years in Homeland Defense, Homeland Security, they were completely transparent to me. I didn't know they existed until I started doing my research. So they are out there. The tribal nations have been in emergency preparedness hundreds and hundreds of years. They've always been in emergency preparedness, taking care of themselves. And that was a true revelation to me, that it's going on now, but again, it was transparent to me. It's probably transparent to others as well. I also asked a question of a tribal nation emergency support function. And there I got some split responses. On the federal side, it was about 50-50. Many of the federal folks from BIA, FEMA, DOD said, well, yeah, that could be good. They need it. Others argued, well, maybe not so. Maybe we just need to make the current system work. On the tribal side, overwhelmingly, there was support for an emergency support function to the National Response Framework dedicated to tribal nations. Again, for the most part, what really struck me about all this is when I talked to individuals like us, people who are in the know, when I talked to those kinds of folks about with my questions, my interview questions, it really surprised me how much agreement there was among them to closing this gap, to improving things. There was frustration at systems, trying to move systems and make systems adapt or change to close those gaps. So the amount of agreement was, like I said, a true surprise to me. Implications from the study, from the things that Margaret and Steve have said, I think it's time we need to give more voice to tribal nations in Homeland Defense, Homeland Security. We've touched on the moral and legal obligation. What I'd really like to touch on is the practical imperative. Again, if we have this Homeland Defense, Homeland Security enterprise, and yet we have these gaps and seams that are vulnerable to exploitation, we can't truly say that we've secured that enterprise or that we've secured the nation. We won't be able to say that until we actually close that gap. So if for no other reason, it's in our mutual interest to close that gap. We have a practical imperative. Even if we don't want to follow the moral and legal obligations, our interests are intertwined. Tribal nation interests are synonymous with national preparedness interests. So finally, recommendations, some meta-narratives. Steve touched on some of these, and I want to conclude with these. I would recommend exploring means to give the tribal nations that greater seat at the table. One of the things that Steve didn't touch on when he was looking at the national policies, who's aware of the Council of Governors? It's a great initiative. It's a terrific initiative. Dr. Stockton spearheaded that initiative, the development of it, and it brings the states together. It brings membership from DHS, DOD, National Guard, the active military. It brings this great coalition together to improve Homeland Defense. Well, all of the tribal nations were excluded from that. So when I say, a greater seat at the table, for example, it's time to bring the tribal nations into those kinds of initiatives, because even if the governors and the states do come together and you still have that gap, well, that gap's there to be exploited. Greater policy on clarification of federal department roles. What does DHS, or what does the Department of Interior do versus DHS? What does FEMA do versus the BIA? What is the DOD role in there? So clarification of federal department roles to minimize conflicts. An example there would be in a recent conversation. One of the things that my organization within Northcom does is we coordinate search and rescue. We're one of the 4 leads for ESF 9 in the National Response Framework. And so the guys at Northcom that coordinate search and rescue, life-saving right now search and rescue, sit in my branch. In a recent telephone conversation, I heard a person from another agency tell some tribal nation folks that to get that search and rescue support from DOD would require a mission assignment, a request for assistance. And that's absolutely not true. That's not true. When the life-saving request comes in for search and rescue, we don't require a mission assignment. There's an 800 number to call, and we respond now. We don't wait for mission assignments. We don't need, legally, we have the statutory authority to respond. So there's that kind of miscommunication out there. There's that kind of misunderstanding that's out there. Explore means to give the tribal nations tax-based equivalents. They struggle because the only revenue streams they have, the ones that do have revenue streams, are their businesses. So when a disaster disrupts their way of life, their business, they immediately lose their revenue streams. They go into problems. They don't have a tax base to draw off of. So I would recommend means to correct that. And to me, that's a problem that would be eminently correctable. It would take the right level of legislative approach. Explore means to provide alternative flexible disaster relief thresholds. Per capita based approaches rather than the $1 million threshold. Make it a per capita based approach based on the size of the tribe. That's one idea. Explore means or possibilities to consider how to pull together a national tribal emergency management assistance compact. Again, there are large obstacles to making that happen, but still, I think it's an idea that's worthy of exploring. And these came out of that came out of the interview questions that I gave to my interview or to my research participants. And finally, look at ways to gain greater integration of the tribal nations into the emergency support functions in the National Response Framework, whether that's a separate emergency support function for the tribes or whether that's greater integration. I would think the people at the table would have to sit down and figure that out to sort out what would work best. So those are the recommendations from the meta-narrative. We had hoped, or we'd asked at the outset to have a dialogue. At this point, I would ask you, what are your questions?